Series. My name is Nick Soberall. I'm a member of the NERRS Science Collaborative staff. We're glad you can join us today for this webinar titled Human and Environmental Well-Being in Alaska's Kachemak Bay Watershed and Ecosystem Services Assessment with Ellie Flaherty, Kate Kirkpatrick, Trey Snow, and Sabrina Bents. Today, the team will present methods and findings from a master's project that provides insights about current ecosystem services valued in Kachemak Bay using a socio-cultural, place-based ecosystem services framework. The webinar today is part of a monthly webinar series that features research, integrated assessment, and science transfer projects funded by the NERRS Science Collaborative. Some webinars also feature the work of Science Collaborative team members as they engage the reserve system. Please join us for our next webinar on Wednesday, June 26th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time with Dr. Lydia Olander and Sarah Mason of Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. Their webinar is titled Exploring Applications of Ecosystem Service Conceptual Models for Coastal Habitats, and will feature their work with the North Carolina and Rookery Bay NERRS to develop oyster reef and mangrove ecosystem service models, efforts to apply the models to specific restoration sites at these NERRS, and use of the models as a way to think about standardized monitoring of ecosystem service outcomes across the reserve system. You can register for this webinar on our Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar page. Before we get started, we'd like to ask a couple poll questions to get a sense for who's part of today's webinar and your familiarity with the NERRS and Science Collaborative. Please respond when you see the poll at your screen. Okay, we've got some pretty good representation today. People at least have heard about the NERRS system, and looks like we've got a fair few people that actually work for the reserve system, so welcome back. Always good to have you. Second question, we can go ahead and launch the next poll.
Oh, interesting.
Pretty even split, looks like. Lots of people are familiar with the Science Collaborative, and a fair few are not familiar, so just we'll give some quick background for those who aren't. So the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, or NERRS, is a network of 29 unique research reserves as shown on the map in front of you. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. Each reserve is protected for long-term research, water quality monitoring, education, and coastal stewardship. Their mission is to practice and promote stewardship of coasts and estuaries through innovative research, education, and training using a place-based ecosystem of protected areas. The NERRS Science Collaborative is one of the research funding mechanisms for the NERRS. It's currently housed at the University of Michigan through a cooperative agreement with NOAA. The research it supports is distinctive in a few ways. Projects support reserve management needs through highly collaborative research, integrating the end users of research into the research process itself to produce outcome-oriented products, with the goal being research uptake and use. We emphasize engagement through our webinars, and we would love to hear your thoughts and questions. You can send your questions at any time via the questions box, and the speakers will answer them during a question and answer period at the end of the webinar. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Julia Wanda Lux. Julia is an associate professor at the School for Environment and Sustainability here at the University of Michigan and a core team member with the Science Collaborative. She is a collaboration scholar and practitioner and advised the project team presenting today. Julia, thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Before we get underway, I just wanted to give you all a quick background about the genesis of this Kachemak Bay Ecosystem Services project, because it's an opportunity that some of you might be on the webinar might be interested in taking advantage of. The master's program here at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability is a professional degree program that's structured to give students the knowledge and skills they need to be effective professionals in the environmental and sustainability fields. We have an average of about 150 students who enter the master's graduate program. It's a 2-year program. Students come from all over the country and the world, and they specialize in a specific field, such as policy and planning, conservation ecology, sustainable enterprise, behavior, education and communication, environmental informatics, and environmental justice. The students have to fulfill a capstone requirement for graduation. About a quarter of the students do a traditional thesis, individual thesis, but 3/4 of our students do what we call a master's project. And one of those projects is the focus of today's webinar. These projects are interdisciplinary, involving student teams representing 2 or more of the specializations that each has a faculty advisor. And as Nick said, I was the faculty advisor for this Kachemak Bay project. All projects are focused on a pressing real-world issue or problem or question for a real-world client, and the client for this project was the Kachemak Bay Reserve, and they result in a professional product for that client. The teams range in size from 3 to 6 students, and we do about 20 to 25 of them per year. The projects come from both public and private sectors. We do have a joint program with the business school, and so we do have some students who have a private sector client, but most projects have public sector clients. Those would be government agencies at all levels, communities and NGOs. For example, considering the audience for today's webinar, I've advised several projects for NOAA agencies, including the Reserve System, the National Marine Sanctuary Program, the Marine Protected Areas Center. I've advised one on coastal community resilience for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. The schools had community climate adaptation projects with Sea Grant as the client, and environmental education projects for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I've advised projects for land conservancies across the country, and recently did a project for IUCN on community forestry in former Soviet countries. So the upshot is that these projects are wide-ranging and they're client-specific. They're all tailored to the particular question or problem or issue of concern to the client. So real quickly, where do projects come from? Projects can be proposed by clients, by faculty, or by students, and usually they involve interaction between all 3. We have a formal proposal submission process in the fall, and there is an information sheet posted on the Water Center's website where you can learn more about that. The genesis for this Kachemak Bay project that we're going to hear about now was a conversation that Sabrina Bents and Kui Walker of the Kachemak Bay Reserve and I had at a NERRS annual meeting a couple years ago, after which Sabrina and Kui put together a proposal, a draft proposal. They sent it to me. I suggested some revisions to make it manageable and of interest to a student team, and then we submitted it for consideration. And the team you're going to hear from today opted to adopt that project. The students cluster into teams and select projects in the late fall. We hold a client fair that potential clients join either in person or virtually to discuss their projects with students and answer questions. About 50 proposed projects a year get whittled down to 20 to 25 projects. The implementation then occurs over a 12 to 16 to 18 month period. And I'm going to stop there and let the implementation stage be conveyed through the story of this Kachemak Bay Reserve Ecosystem Services project. If there's any questions about the project process itself, we can revisit those in the Q&A at the end and after the team's presentation. So Nick.
Yeah. Okay. So it looks like we're going to get started here. We've got one more poll question we'd like to launch before we start the formal presentation. Excuse me. So we can go ahead and launch that poll. Okay, so it looks like the top two categories here are I'm just learning about these ideas and their applications. I'm right there with you, so I'm looking forward to this presentation as well. And about 50% of people say that these inform their work generally. So that's good background knowledge to have going into the presentation. So Trey will get started with his portion of the presentation.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for joining. This is Trey Snow here, one of the Master's Project group members. So I'm just going to begin kind of giving an overview of our project, the goals, the question, the study site, things of that nature. So just to begin, our project study site was the Kachemak Bay, located in South Central Alaska. The Kachemak Bay really is a special place, both ecologically and socially. Kind of on the northern side of the bay here, dominated by wetlands, spruce forest. The southern side of the bay is home to the first Alaska State Park, the Kachemak Bay State Park, home to glaciers, alpine and subalpine environments. The bay itself is also home to a variety of environment types and species, with over 100 species of fish, 11 species of marine mammals, over 400 species of macroinvertebrates. It's home to a 28-foot tidal range, which really helps support that macroinvertebrate biodiversity. So that's just a general overview of our study site area. So then, as Julia mentioned, this project was really focused on the client goals and the client needs. And some of the goals when we first started discussing this project with KBNERR included they wanted a way to kind of engage the community in research and management in the area. And they also were looking to see how could they incorporate ecosystem services into their ongoing reserve management plan. What were potential ecosystem services of interest to look at, or how could they do future ecosystem service studies? And then lastly, given the collaborative nature of the network of NERRS, are there any ways that other NERRS, other research reserves could incorporate these methods or incorporate this project in their own work? And with that in mind, the major basis of our project really revolves around this concept of ecosystem services. And so it seems like some of you have familiarity with that, others not so much. The major definition that we use, as proposed by Gretchen Daly, ecosystem services are the conditions and processes through which natural ecosystems and the species that make them up help sustain and fulfill human life. And so this next diagram here is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was funded and proposed by the United Nations. And a couple major takeaways from this diagram and from the field of ecosystem services generally. The first one is really trying to connect this structure and processes of the ecosystem, these services, to well-being here on the right side of the figure. How is the supporting well-being benefiting human populations? The second major thing is how can we incorporate or account for the value of these services, account for the value of ecosystems to help inform local, state, or federal, or even global decision-making. So those are kind of two major proponents of ecosystem services as we saw it. And then next, I'm just going to go over kind of the theoretical framework, the roadmap of our project, and the broader idea to give you some understanding. So the major focus of our project were the ecosystem services, and we're trying to understand, okay, what's the suite of ecosystem services that people value in the area? For example, salmon, or the aesthetics or recreation opportunities. And then from there, with this as a key, so previous research really has looked at the ecological values of these services or the monetary value, so trying to ascribe a dollar amount And we sort of wanted to kind of triangulate this, and we really focused on the social values. So these could be economic values, but then also thinking more broadly, what are other ways that people describe their interactions and the benefits that they receive from a particular landscape or a service of that landscape. And so that was a major focus for our project, are these social values. And then from there, what are the perceived drivers of service health? So what are the threats and assets that are either positively or negatively impacting ecosystem health? And what are the perceptions of these drivers? And then lastly, how do people talk about the signs of health in the ecosystem? How do they see when things are particularly pristine, healthy, or degraded? And how could we potentially bridge this gap between the ecosystem service literature and what we're hearing in our interviews and from our project to give KBNERR really community relevant indicators and community relevant language to help discuss and monitor these services. And with that in mind, here are the specific research questions. I kind of went over these with that diagram. So what are the services valued? How are they valued? What are the threats and assets, indicators of health? And then we also talked about and asked about management decisions. So then next, I'm going to go over the methods that we use to try to answer these questions. This project primarily relied on qualitative methods with a site visit in late May and early June. We did 31 semi-structured interviews that lasted approximately an hour each with key informant sampling as provided by KBNERR with a variety of stakeholders, user groups, citizen groups. And then our analysis included memoing on the interviews, transcribing verbatim. And then from that transcription, we did a coding exercises where we tried to see, okay, what themes are we seeing that are similar to the current research, and then what themes are we seeing that are kind of organically rising from the interview that are unique to this place or emergent themes. And so as I mentioned, we had a wide sample of 31 hour-long interviews with a variety of government representatives, nonprofits, other ecotourism, economic development, and here's just a brief list of that. And then we primarily relied on in vivo software to help organize and catalog these interviews. If you have any questions about the software, we'd love to talk about it, but it really is a helpful software and program to utilize with this kind of research, and we found it very effective for coding and trying to extract meaning from our interviews. In addition to these interviews, we also conducted focus groups, and the interview protocol and focus group protocol are located in the full report. The basic overview of the focus groups is we did kind of a brainstorming exercise where we asked people, okay, what benefits do you get from the landscape? What are the services as you see it? Then we organized these as such and did a little bit of a voting exercise there with as you can see with the red dots. And then from there, we shifted on the right side. You can see more of a conceptual modeling, more brainstorming and exercises about, okay, what are the drivers or the perceived drivers that are impacting this service, wildlife habitat in this case, and then what are benefits that people get from this. And we thought this was a really effective way to engage people with these concepts of ecosystem services and really try to hear from people what they value, why they value certain resources.
Hi everyone, this is Kate, and I'll be talking about some of our results. So the first question that we asked our 31 interviewees was, what resources are important to you? And this was really to identify what ecosystem services were most important to our interviewees, but we realized that just going into this community and asking that type of question, we might come across a lot of people who don't really know what ecosystem services are. So through these other probes, like what places are important to you or your family, what is particularly valuable about these places, through these types of questions, we were able to tease out how people interact with the Bay ecosystem, what is valued specifically in these personal experiences, and then on our end, determine what ecosystem services those might be. So just valued resources in general, we found that our interviewees really valued fish, wildlife, recreation, aesthetics, tourism, ecological processes and functions like biodiversity and nutrient cycling, agriculture, and forest. And there are many different benefits for each of these resources were brought up, showing that the community values each resource in several different ways. So if we take a closer look at fish or fisheries across our interviews, we found that the community benefits from fish or fisheries in the many different ways outlined on this slide. And so I do have examples for each of these. So many interviewees noted the economic values associated with fish. This woman quoted here says it's been her husband's business in Kachemak Bay for 30 years, and her kids are sea captains. Many people in the bay make their livelihood off of the fish in some capacity, whether they're fishermen, ecotourist companies, or restaurants. We also heard about how fish create this community culture. This interviewee calls it a coastal community and how it's very cool to live in a place where people really care about what they do because it matters for things like salmon fishing. And we heard phrases like coastal community and fishing community quite a bit, and many people value that aspect of the culture of the bay. A lot of interviewees brought up subsistence fishing, whether they subsistence fish themselves or they recognize that many people, specifically native communities, rely heavily on it. This interviewee does dip netting and thinks that having access to be able to harvest his or her own food is really, really important. Recreational and sport fishing is a big part of life on the bay. Kachemak Bay does attract a lot of tourists for that reason, and many interviewees noted the benefits of this. A lot of interviewees fish recreationally as well, and they associated different values with this, like having a relaxing experience on the water, something that they kind of get away from the city life and the hustle and bustle and just find time to themselves on the water. And since our hour-long interviews allowed for storytelling, people would often talk about their personal connections to the bay. And so this ranged from memories of family trips to realizations of what makes Kachemak Bay home or their anchor. And the couple quoted on this side talks about fishing on the spit with friends and family and how their son grew up looking forward to fishing time. And finally, there were quite a few interviewees who saw research and education as a benefit of fish and also a benefit to fish and fisheries. This topic was seen as important for fisheries management, the preservation of salmon habitat, as well as fostering a knowledgeable and caring community. This quote here explains how research done by KBNERR led to the realization that damage to small, seemingly insignificant streams can really impact fish populations in a negative way. And so with all of these resources valued and the many different ways people value them, we also wanted to identify how people see them being threatened and what things are actually assets. So we wanted to know, what are the threats and assets to the bay? And this was another way to tease out what is valued, and it would also inform KBNERR on what the main concerns are. What are the common perceptions? Are there ways that KBNERR can communicate these threats better, and what assets are there for KBNERR to potentially utilize? And so we saw a variety of perceived threats among interviewees, but many of them were directly human-induced, like increasing development, social division, including political divides, and the overuse, overharvesting of aquatic life. And while climate change was brought up in over half the interviews, it really did seem to be sort of an abstract idea and more of a passing comment. But when people were describing the ways that something like increasing development impacted the bay, they gave us really specific examples, like how it was destroying the salmon habitat or changing their daily aesthetic or changing the overall culture of the bay. And perceived assets was not actually a question that we asked directly, but these were naturally pulled out in conversations about threats. And as much as direct human impacts were a threat, many people discussed how having a dynamic community is an asset and how humans themselves can be assets. So specifically having a community that is diverse in its opinion, which allows for new approaches and conversations to be held, or having a strongly engaged community that is very passionate about the protection of these values mentioned before. So basically everybody really works together to get stuff done in this type of community. We also wanted to know how the community can tell whether a resource is healthy or degraded. And this line of questioning was based on Olander et al.'s paper in 2018, which, as we mentioned earlier, she'll be here next month to do a webinar series. So her 2018 paper examines what she calls benefit relevant indicators, or BRIs, which link biophysical outcomes to social benefits and is especially useful when a valuation method is not feasible, and Trey will discuss some more of that later. But in this project, we call BRIs community relevant indicators or simply perceived signs of health. And these indicators are also a way for KBNERR and other researchers to be more transparent and improve communication with the community. So when you provide a layperson with data like dissolved oxygen content, people sometimes don't really understand what that is, and there's a chance that it won't really sink in. So with all that in mind, our interviewees identified several signs of health, and they see the presence of certain valued species and the abundance of these species as a major sign of health for the bay. And they also see the physical size of valued species like salmon, halibut, or clams as a good sign of health, as well as the quality of the resource in terms of their own senses, like do the clams taste good? Is the timber hard? Is the water clear?
All right. Hi, everyone. This is Ellie Flaherty, the third and final team member. And the next portion of our report focused on perceptions of natural resource management decisions in and around the bay. So we focused on these perceptions of natural resource management decisions and policies to further tease out the kinds of services, places, or resources that are important to our interviewees. And the goal of understanding these perceptions was to further identify what's value to them by kind of teasing out, like Kate talked about, how those valued services are impacted and the state of their well-being. And to kind of tease out those questions or tease out those answers, we ask questions like, in what ways do management decisions of several levels positively or negatively affect valued places or resources? And then as a probing question with some interviewees, if this question felt a bit abstract, we would ask, if you were in charge of planning and decision making for this valued resource, how would you go about it? So from these questions, we got quite a range of responses. Interviewees expressed both negative and positive perceptions of natural resource management in Kachemak Bay. Often interviewees had mixed negative and positive perceptions depending on the topic they were talking about. Most frequently discussed aspects of management include fisheries management, hunting and harvest regulations, and then other land use and zoning policies. So of those that conveyed a negative perception of natural resource management, their primary focus areas included their perception that there are science or information gaps that prevent effective policies from being developed or implemented, their perception that there could be budget constraints that inhibit research or the enforcement of current policies, the perception of a lack of effectiveness of current policies or current policies that don't necessarily work in conjunction with one another. And finally, the perception that there could be political or financial influence from industrial, economic development, or extraction interests that influence natural resource decision making. And at the root of many of these comments that express some kind of negative perception of management was this idea that management was considered sometimes to be more reactive than proactive, and reactive to present threats versus proactive to prevent threats. And this was often cited when talking about, I think, fisheries and shellfish management. And this kind of reaction was attributed by interviewees to, the several factors that I mentioned before. And it is important to think about, especially in this section, that these are interviewee perceptions and they're not necessarily fact-checked. It's their opinions, but I think that is still very valuable information to know what people think. And then as far as the positive perceptions are concerned, many interviewees who expressed some kind of positive aspect of natural resource management described federal and state public lands and how the protections provided by public lands, both in the Kenai Peninsula as a whole and in the Kachemak Bay area, specifically with the state critical habitat area, can be huge assets for the continued health and well-being of this area. Interviewees also talked about various local policies and protections like zoning ordinances and stream buffers that they perceive to be very effectively protecting important habitat areas. And then finally, scientific research that's done both by the Kachemak Bay Reserve and state management agencies like the Department of Fish and Game, both of which that help to inform local natural resources decision-making, were seen as incredible assets to the area. And interviewees recognize the integration of local decision-making and this place-based local research, and they thought that was a pretty great asset for their environment. Then moving on to a more ecosystem service and analysis portion of our report, from this slew of responses and slew of information that we received, we began analyzing and organizing all of these results through social value typologies as they apply to ecosystem service research. And at a 10,000-foot level, social value typologies look at non-monetary values associated with ecosystem services and can be a tool for representing and communicating the benefits that people perceive that they derive from an ecosystem. Our analysis specifically was based on the social value typology developed by Zachary Cole in 2012. This social value typology was designed specifically based on ecosystem services provided by coastal areas and has been employed by several other national estuarine research reserves in their socio-cultural ecosystem service studies, which kind of prompted us to use this as a starting point for this one as well. The Cole framework includes 16 different value types, and these range from a value of biodiversity to value of recreational opportunities, subsistence opportunities, to a value of the economic benefits from ecosystem services, and even more. However, we found that despite the fairly comprehensive nature of this existing framework, when applying it to the very place-based data collected in Kachemak Bay, there were some discrepancies that emerged. So our response to that was to provide KBNERR with the most relevant framework that reflects the thoughts and values expressed in interviews. And to do so, we modified the Cole framework to better reflect what we were hearing when we were in the Kachemak Bay area. So the social value typology framework, designed specifically to Kachemak Bay, addresses a couple issues that came up when applying the Cole framework to the Kachemak Bay data. The first was some of the definitions and descriptions of the value types presented in the Cole article were indeed present in our interviews, but were represented or described slightly differently by our interviewees than how they were described by Cole. And then second, there were some quite prevalent value types expressed in interviews that were not apparent in the Cole framework that we added. So the final Kachemak Bay framework that Trey will go into a little bit later, like the potential uses of this framework and how it can be a springboard for different communication tools or research, is divided into 3 different sections. The first that is seen on the left-hand side are values that were represented in our interviews and aligned with what was represented in the existing Cole framework. So the names of those value types and the definition are consistent with what Cole presented. The second column in the middle, those modified from the Cole framework, represent values that were expressed by interviewees that were present in the Cole framework, but had those definitions that were provided by Cole that didn't accurately capture what was described in our interviews. So for these, the value type from Cole was kept, but the definition was altered to better reflect what we were hearing in Kachemak Bay. And one example of this type of value is this access. So as an example, Cole describes this access value as places of common property free from access restrictions or exclusive ownership or control. However, we found that when we saw our interviewees expressing this access value, they often weren't necessarily talking about a complete absence of restrictions or regulations, but rather the ability for their access to valued activities or opportunities to be able to persist and coexist with regulations or management strategies that maintain the quality of their resources and their experiences over time. So we try to reflect that aspect of this access value in our modified definition. And one interviewee described kind of their passion for the ability to show others Kachemak Bay and how he thinks that that is very valuable, very special, but how that has to be done cautiously and in a planned fashion. And then the final aspect of this Kachemak Bay specific framework are a set of values that we termed as connections. And these were values that were not represented in the Cole framework and that emerged through kind of the storytelling and the memories that interviewees shared with us. And these connections represent the often subtler and more nuanced connections that interviewees felt to their community, to nature, to their family, or to their sense of personal identity that seemed to be integrated and entwined with the fact that they live and work in this Kachemak Bay ecosystem. And then one example of this type of connection is this connection to self or personal identity. So this value type represents interviewee experiences or beliefs that some aspect of the Kachemak Bay ecosystem informs their sense of identity and the way they choose to live their lives. So one interviewee in particular described how in her soul is the gardener, the forager, the gatherer, the fisher woman, and living in the Kachemak Bay area allows her to live out this part of herself that she may not be able to otherwise, and that is, a very valuable type of ecosystem service, we think. So, and I'll hand it back on over to Trey to wrap up.
Awesome. Okay, hello everyone. This is Trey again. And as you've kind of seen through this project, this is definitely a starting point for KBNERR to continue monitoring ecosystem services over time through different methods or different manners. In the last chapter, we really wanted to focus on, okay, what ways, now that we have an understanding of the suite of ecosystem services and this social value typology, what are ways that KBNERR can use these moving forward? Some of the deliverables, as most master's projects include a set of deliverables to give to the client. The ones for this included that social value framework that Ellie just went through. Additionally, we tried to bridge this connection between what we're hearing in the interviews and what does the current literature of ecosystem services say, and how can we connect these to dubbed community relevant indicators. And then lastly, we've also included some case examples of previous studies of ecosystem research that we think would be applicable to Kachemak Bay NERR or to other NERRs potentially. And so the first of that, these indicators, we kind of went through supporting, regulating, provisioning, and cultural ecosystem services, more in the full-length report. And we think that these, especially supporting and regulating, are especially relevant, even though they were brought up in interviews. Oftentimes, they weren't mentioned explicitly like some of the other provisioning services. And here we can see we've got some nutrients. We've got nutrient cycling, primary production, habitat formation. And then on the right, we've got some standard ecological metrics, as well as some more economic metrics of willingness to pay or avoided costs. Next, within our case examples that we provide for KBNERR and ways that they continue to research ecosystem services, the big one and the primary one in the field is monetary evaluation. So trying to apply a dollar value to a particular service through surveys or through other secondary economic data like housing prices. And two major examples that we think could be used. The first is a contingent valuation. So what's asking through surveys the question, what's your willingness to pay for forest, stream bank, marine habitat restoration, and then ascribing a dollar value that way. Additionally, benefit transfer could be applicable where you get the value from previous studies for a particular service, and then you apply that previous value to your current study site through geospatial data or other sources of data. In addition to monetary valuation, we think that there is definitely a chance to continue the socio-cultural valuation and try to apply it in a quantitative context. This social value quantification has been applied by other NERRs, including the Sapelo Islands and Mission Aransas. This is through surveys, whether online or in person, as well as there's a geospatial aspect to it, a mapping aspect, using the USGS's SOLVES model. And just as an example, kind of the way this works is that a particular value type, for this case, recreation, or the example of access that Ellie mentioned, people would distribute their values across a map. And then from there, you can derive heat maps like this one or other ways to try to fix these concepts into specific places that could be for further study or for further outreach. Additionally, we provided, given the social value typology that we created, we provided a set of survey questions sort of on a Likert scale here of what are your perceptions of benefits received from this ecosystem to try to tease out more of that quantified aspect of these values. Additionally, things like drivers, we also included questions on drivers, perceived drivers in a similar format. And then lastly, I just want to conclude with some comments on ecosystem service frameworks, both for KBNERR, but also for other NERRs generally. Through our project, we found that this framework and ecosystem services generally are an effective tool to really try to communicate value to people, to the public, and how it's connected to the ecosystem. And we think that interview guides and focus group design, the focus group design we included are especially helpful, and they're included in the full report, which is on the Science Collaborative website, I believe. And so maybe looking at those as a way to engage the community to try to tease out what they value, their interactions with the landscape. However, because the ecosystem service field is so broad, we definitely ran into some challenges with this project and just moving forward, things to be mindful of. It's often in the marine ecosystem service literature, at least, it's really tough, this complexity between the ecological function and then connecting that back to human well-being, issues of double counting, issues of valuation, things of that nature. Additionally, trying to get your definitions right and definitions that are relevant to the community. Oftentimes with the focus groups, people were confused. What's the difference between a supporting service or a regulating service? So really trying to be clear on what you consider an ecosystem service, how you define it, how you describe it, and making sure to convey that in a way that can be understood. Additionally, and that definition thing kind of comes up in tourism, where some argue that tourism is an ecosystem service, whereas others would indicate that, no, it's recreation that is more of an ecosystem service, and really trying to be clear about those definitions. Lastly, with this qualitative-based study, and we had a sample size of about 31, sometimes some voices can be left out, which is tough to account for. And with that, I just want to hand it over to Sabrina Bents, who is the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at Kachemak Bay National Estuary Research Reserve, just to get her take on kind of the benefits of the project. A quick introduction to Sabrina. As I mentioned, she's the Coastal Training Program Coordinator. She works with the NERRS manager to provide a bridge between reserve-based science and management of Alaskan coastal ecosystems through decision-maker training, stakeholder engagement, and technical assistance. She's working on assessments of community needs, emerging coastal research, and coastal management issues to help shape the program's priorities and better serve local decision makers. And with that, Sabrina, if you have any comments on the project or process or outcome.
Thanks, Trey. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep. Great. So there are three main ways that I wanted to highlight that Kachemak Bay Reserve will use the outputs from this project. The first one is using the assessment to identify or refine priority coastal management issues and knowledge gaps and communicate them through our management plans and training program strategies. The second way we'll use it is these outputs will help us to identify new research projects and partners to develop lines of inquiry around socio-ecological systems in Kachemak Bay. And finally, we'll use the suggestions to explore methods of monitoring socio-cultural data in Kachemak Bay to link with our long-term biophysical monitoring programs that we already do. And I can go into a little bit more depth on each of these applications, but I do want to make sure that there is some time for questions afterwards. So the first way we're going to be using this information is that it'll inform the Kachemak Bay NERRS management plan and coastal training program strategy by better understanding our community perceptions of threats and values related to ecological functions and services. The perceived threats could be used to identify resource and land use conflicts and management issues that we could address through future reserve and outreach efforts. Many of the issues identified in the project are social drivers intrinsic to our local or regional decision making, so there may be opportunities to preserve ecosystem services through development of new information products to clear up uncertainty, or working on additional behavior change strategies such as community-based social marketing, training, and outreach. Going on to the second application, the outputs from this project are a foundation to incorporate an ecosystem services framework in future research projects to define, monitor, and measure benefits of coastal ecosystems. The ES analysis that the team produced will be useful in communicating with partners, researchers, and local decision makers to increase literacy about ecosystem services projects. And the report summaries and case study ideas outlined in the full report will be useful in identifying new lines of inquiry for socio-ecological research, as well as capacity gaps at our reserve for future partnerships with researchers who have expertise in this field. So we'll use it to kind of hang out a shingle of, here's a future project. We may not have those researchers on staff at the reserve, but it'll help us better partner with additional expertise. And then finally, the team does provide guidance for additional and iterative data collection of qualitative socio-cultural information. Tracking benefit relevant indicators of health will be useful to connect human and social well-being to natural systems and ecological processes here in Kachemak Bay. The team provides the suggestions to identify secondary economic data that would be useful for tracking monetary value, as well as concepts that would need to be captured via more hands-on data collection approaches like surveys and interviews. Their interview methods and the updated interview guide in the report can be used to engage additional stakeholder groups the team was not able to access during their time in Kachemak Bay. And we can also use the versions of the perceived signs of health to move towards paired long-term monitoring with the biophysical system-wide monitoring program the NERRS system conducts. And it would be also very interesting to explore the social value typology that is unique to Kachemak Bay versus values that could be compared across the reserve system.
Great, thanks. Great work, everybody, on that presentation. We've got a couple questions here in the Q&A. We'll move right into it. Just as a reminder, you can type your questions into the console using the questions panel. Should be a little picture on the next slide, I think, just for quick reference.
Sure.
Yeah, just one more real quick. Just so you see it. You can type questions in, and it'll come directly to the staff, and we'll read them out loud. So if you have a question, feel free to post it that way. First question here is for Sabrina. This question says, has this project raised the profile of the NERRS with the local community?
This project gave us a really great way to engage our community council, which is a advisory board for the reserve. The team conducted their focus groups with the council members, which are a board of 12 citizens that are appointed, as well as partner agencies. So just their engagement with that group really helped, I think, develop a deeper understanding of what ecosystem services are with our advisory board. And we haven't done a lot of outreach using the report yet. We just received it recently, so we're going to definitely explore how we can use information contained in the report and package to reach out to additional community members.
Excellent, thank you. Got another question here. I think this is for the general team. What percentage of interviewees were First Nations peoples?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we weren't able to access those communities in any kind of formal capacity to be interviewed, and that is a gap that's outlined in our report and a suggestion we made for KBNERR going forward. Unfortunately, in our limited time there, we just didn't have the resources or the capacity to access the Native groups or the Russian groups that live in and value and impact the Bay. I don't know if my group members have anything to add.
We were able to talk informally to a couple of them, but yeah, again, unfortunately, in terms of the hour-long interview process, we were unable to set that up. But.
Another question coming in. Are there any plans to place monetary values on some of these ecosystem services?
That would be a question for Sabrina.
Probably a question for Sabrina, yeah.
Okay. We would like to look a little bit more at economic data and secondary economic indicators, such as housing, access, things like that. We don't have a lot of ongoing monitoring of economic information, but we did like the suggestions that the team made as far as what we could do in the future as far as monetary valuation. We just haven't gone very far down that road yet.
I'd also like to include that there have been previous master's projects from the University of Michigan that have done monetary evaluation, like the methods I mentioned. So that could potentially be another avenue for KBNERR or maybe another participant in the webinar to look into proposing a master's project that would do a monetary evaluation of a particular service.
Another question for Sabrina looks like, what are your thoughts on how the NERRS should move forward in this area of socio-ecological systems work? For example, large-scale assessments across the reserve system are being explored right now by the NERRS, or more community-based, place-based investigations like yours. So just to reiterate the question again, what are your thoughts on how the NERRS should move forward in this area of socio-ecological systems work?
There's a question from Jude Apple. I know you've had some collaborations already.
Oh, thanks, Jude, for the question. I think there's value in looking at the whole reserve as a system, as well as these more deeper dives into individual reserves, because I think that every reserve is unique, obviously, and these place-based kind of case studies can help test out whether broader ecosystem services assessments for the full system will be applicable to each individual reserve.
I have a question for you all. What was the biggest surprise for you in doing this project? There, you kind of stand out unexpected things.
I think for me, this is Kate. I think for me, it was a pleasant surprise with how willing people were to talk with us. I mean, even though we had set up these hour-long interviews, a lot of times those went over an hour, and they were 2 or 3 hours. So people were many people were very happy to talk about Kachemak Bay and happy to share with us Kachemak Bay. And so that was just a nice surprise, because I think maybe some of us were under the impression that people wouldn't want to talk to us about this. So.
Anything else for you, Sabrina, in terms of surprises for you?
I was pretty intrigued about just the cautionary note on how to tackle tourism in an ecosystem services framework, especially since our coastal economy is heavily dependent on tourism businesses. So that's definitely something that this preliminary information about it and caution on how to tackle that is useful, but it kind of whetted my appetite to look into that a little bit more.
Neat.
Got time for a couple more questions here. This first one comes from our reserve friends in Hawaii, so glad they could join us today. The question is, do you consider biodiversity an ecosystem service?
Yeah, in our framework, biodiversity is included as an ecosystem service. In Chapter 2, What is Valued, biodiversity is discussed under the umbrella of ecological processes that interviewees brought up, which in the context of our report, that's just where that tended to fit best, even though that can be its own standalone ecosystem service. But yes, that is represented in our framework and in the report.
Okay. And the second question here, I'll pose one more comment before we take this last question. You can continue to type your questions in. We'll be sure to include them in the Q&A that is part of the webinar brief that is released after the webinar. In the interest of time, we'll just take one more question before we wrap up here. And that question is, are there any differences between how your interviewees perceive threats to ecosystem services and how the reserve perceives or understands threats? Yeah, sure. Sabrina, do you want to try to answer that one? Yeah, just to repeat that question, are there any differences between how you're... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, could you repeat it? I'm sorry.
Sure. Are there any differences between how your interviewees perceive threats to ecosystem services and how the reserve perceives or understands threats?
Yeah, so I can take a stab at that one. It was interesting when our reserve manager, Kui Walker, and I were reviewing this report, And we found ourselves nodding our heads a lot as we went through some of the sections of the report and some of the quotes that the team had highlighted in the report. So I think that we were, there weren't a lot of surprises there as far as how we understood our community. The interesting thing that I think both Kui and I really honed in on was this idea of connectivity to, that when the team described their social values typology, that connectivity piece was really interesting to us because we're trying to communicate connectivity in the biophysical systems a lot through our work right now. And it was just really interesting to see that mirrored in this more socio-cultural values and connectivity as well.
I know we said we take one more question there, but there's this one last question here that I see in the chat box that I think is a good sort of parting thought. So I'll go ahead and just ask the team real quickly. The question says, I'll be teaching teachers about the Hudson River watershed this summer. How do I apply what you have done with social connections and resource management? Any off-the-cuff thoughts?
I think it would be really interesting to do a survey in that area, if possible, and just kind of get a preliminary idea of what people value about the Hudson River, just as a start.
Yeah, and I would, this is Julia, I would add to what Kate said in the, I think it's the second chapter of the report where the team goes into their discussion of what people in Kachemak Bay value about the bay, that the team used that as a stepping stone to then identify, so what are the ecosystem services that are valued? Because as they mentioned, it's very difficult to ask somebody, what are the ecosystem services that you value? But it's very easy to ask them, what's important about this place? And from an educational perspective, you could see interacting with community members, you could see even interacting with children and asking them, what's special about this river? What's special about this place? How does it connect to you and your family? And use that as a stepping stone to starting to talk about. So what are the systems that this ecosystem, the services that the system is providing to you and your family and your community?
Okay, that's great.
Thanks, Julia. Our time is nearly up, so just a couple of quick comments before we adjourn. Okay, thank you to everyone that participated in the webinar today. It's great to see so much interest in these ecosystem service assessments and their potential impacts. Please keep an eye out for future webinar announcements. We have many interesting projects wrapping up over the coming months that will be sharing their findings and lessons learned, and some panel webinars under development that will look across several projects. To follow along, you can sign up for webinar announcements as part of the exit survey that follows this webinar. It'll be open immediately after the webinar ends, and also you'll receive an email tomorrow automatically from the GoToWebinar platform.